Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This is a module on linguistic acculturation and linguistic areas as part of the course Introduction to Linguistics. I am your course teacher for this module. I am Anish Koshi. I teach at the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. In this module, we would like to acquaint you with the notion of linguistic acculturation and that of linguistic areas. Let us begin with linguistic acculturation. The term acculturation basically means being familiar or becoming familiar with different cultures. Linguistic acculturation, thus, is the process of coming into contact with speakers of different languages and becoming acquainted with their cultural and material lives. Now, when speakers of different languages come into contact with each other and come to know about cultural items in the language of the other person, there are different things that languages would do. And that is exactly what we know as linguistic acculturation. So, a speaker of language A may have to do certain things to now understand and make it part of his or her own language, the cultural items that they have learnt or come to know from the language of the other person, and vice versa. So languages may then choose to borrow, languages may choose to shift the meaning of certain words, languages may choose to innovate with words, or even to extend the meanings of existing words. Let's begin with the first phenomenon, borrowing. Borrowing, as the term itself suggests, is a process whereby lexical items found in the language that the speaker has come into contact with is borrowed into the language of the speaker. Now, this can happen for different reasons, but most of the times it is, number one, an unfamiliarity with the particular object or the particular idea. The other could also be reasons of prestige. We know that many Dravidian languages have thus borrowed a number of words, especially Telugu and Malayalam, have borrowed many words from Sanskrit. Sometimes even mistakenly leading the speakers of these and other languages to believe that Sanskrit is the mother of all Indian languages, which is definitely not true. These Dravidian languages, Telugu and Malayalam, have nothing to do with Sanskrit, except the fact that for the speakers of these languages, Sanskrit has been the language of prestige, the language of the scriptures, and which has led to the borrowing of many words into these languages for matters of prestige. It has happened also with English, not necessarily because of reasons of prestige, but because speakers of English now are acquainted with different kinds of concepts which are found in other languages, which they have found it necessary to borrow into their own language. Let us look at a few examples of words that have been borrowed into English from different world languages. You might probably be surprised to know that so many of these words are not actually originally English. Let us look at a few examples. The word cafeteria in English comes from Spanish. The word coach, as in railway coaches, comes from Hungarian. The word ballet, the dance form, comes from French. The word tea in English, one of the most favorite beverages of English speakers today, comes from Chinese. The word democracy, something that the Western world today takes a lot of pride in, comes from Greek. The word khaki comes from Urdu. Hindi contributes many words, including the word lute, and Arabic has contributed words like algebra to English. What is true, though, about most situations of contact is that borrowing is often imbalanced, in the sense that it is often seen that it is one of the languages that ends up borrowing quite a lot of words from the other language compared to the other language. And this often happens because most situations of contact are not on an equal footing. We've seen this in our discussion on language contact in another module, that most often the situations of contact where borrowing actually takes place are situations where one language arrives on the scene as the more prestigious, as the more patronized, and the more economically viable one, and therefore it is often seen that borrowing across languages is mostly imbalanced. Well, the borrowing of items is not limited to merely lexical items, that is words. Even phonological and grammatical systems may also be borrowed. One very famous example of phonological borrowing is in the Indian scenario. You will be surprised to know, if you did not know it already, that Hindi and many other Indo-Aryan languages originally, at least, were not supposed to have had retroflex sounds. These sounds, which are commonly found in all Dravidian languages, ta, ta, da, da, na, actually are not found in any Indo-European languages except the Indo-Aryan languages of India, of the Indian subcontinent. So English doesn't have it, French doesn't have it, Persian doesn't have it. So the question naturally that comes about is, where did Hindi get these sounds, ta, ta, da, da, na? Of course, these have been borrowed from the Dravidian languages, which have all had these sounds. Now, what about grammatical borrowing? We know that English forms its plurals by adding an affix s or s at the end of words. So you get boys from boy, you get dogs from dog, you get churches from church, and the like. But there are many irregular plurals in English. No, we're not talking about the sheep kind. But we also have words like datum, data in English, radius, radii in English, where there are distinct singular and plural forms. Now, these words were borrowed into English from Latin. But what English ended up doing was not merely borrowing the words, but also borrowing the grammatical rules of pluralization for these words. And therefore, instead of saying datum is borrowed and let's form the plural as datums, English forms the plural as data, just like Latin does. So we find that borrowing can happen at the level of words, can happen at the level of sounds, can also happen at the level of grammatical rules. Now, what do languages do after they borrow such words? So since we are discussing acculturation is a process of making items from another culture part of one's own culture. We find that very often words that are borrowed are made to go through a process of naturalization. A process of naturalization is where words that are borrowed from another language are subjected to the phonological rules and the phonotactic constraints of the mother tongue of the borrowing speaker and changed and transformed accordingly. Thus, ice cream for a Japanese speaker is no more ice cream because it has too many clusters. Japanese is a language that prefers the CV syllable structure, and therefore ice cream becomes something like aisu kurimu. Similarly, we have words like milk, again with a cluster of l and k, something which is not possible according to the phonotactics of Japanese, and therefore it is transformed into the CV pattern of syllables as miruku. Now, it is not something that we are strangers to. Something very similar has happened with almost all English words borrowed into Indian languages. Let us look at a sample of some of the words that have been borrowed from English into Indian languages and the way they have been naturalized according to the phonotactic constraints of the languages, Indian languages that have borrowed them. Now, for most speakers of Malayalam, for example, the English pronunciation of the fruit apple would be too difficult, and therefore it is naturalized as apple. Similarly, for Hindi speakers, a word like camera with its a vowel is naturalized into something like camera. For most Punjabi speakers, a word like station is naturalized as station. For most Telugu speakers, a word like zoo beginning with a sound z is naturalized as ju. And for many Tamil speakers, a word like egg, which does not have an onset to the coda, the word is transformed or naturalized as yeg. For Marathi speakers, a word like smell becomes a word like smell. For most Bangla speakers, words like slip and sleep become sleep. And for many Odia speakers, a word like under becomes something like onder. So we see that most speakers of languages, when they borrow words into their language, would subject it to a process of naturalization that is fitted according to the phonotactic constraints of the language. Now, the same phenomenon of naturalization is considered a process of interference if it is carried on when speaking English as a second language. So, while a word like apple or Jew or smell might be okay when we use it in a structure of Marathi or Malayalam, but it will not be the same if we were speaking English and then using these words with these pronunciations. In those contexts, the same phenomenon, what is known as naturalization, would be considered as a process of interference. What we also see is that when speakers of languages borrow words into their languages, they also sometimes end up transferring some of the phonetic features from the language from which it is borrowed. Very interestingly, again in Hindi, for example, for many speakers of Hindi who also speak English as well as also some Urdu words, we find that they find the Hindi word for fruit to be phal, which is the use of a labiodental fricative f. The actual Hindi pronunciation of the word is actually a voiceless aspirated plosive and is to be pronounced as phal. Instead of pronouncing it as phal, most Hindi speakers today who know English pronounce it as phal. Now the sound f, the labiodental fricative, is not original to Hindi. What has happened is because of many Urdu words like furs and fikr, which have become part of the vocabulary of most Hindi speakers, and of course the influence of English with many words beginning with f like fruit and fly or fry, this sound has been transferred into the phonetic inventory of the speakers of Hindi, and thus there has been a transfer, so to speak. We also find that situations of acculturation could lead to lexical innovation or semantic displacement. Think about the English word butler. The English word butler originally was related to the concept of bottles or wine bottles, and the butler was actually somebody who was a bearer of wine bottles. But those were times when a household which could employ a butler could employ many servants, and therefore you could have specific roles assigned to each of these servants. With times changing, with people being maximally able to employ one maid servant, the concept of butler has been extended to mean bearer of anything, which would basically mean somebody who does any kind of odd job in the household. So these are instances of innovation or semantic displacement. Situations of sustained language contact which lead to what we've been discussing now as linguistic acculturation finally leads to the creation of what are known as linguistic areas. Linguistic areas are geographical areas where two or more languages belonging to different language families are spoken, and these languages have been in contact over a sustained period of time, sometimes extending to centuries. These sustained periods of contact between languages that belong to different linguistic families often result in languages borrowing and adapting features from languages belonging to the other language families. Two very important notions that are spoken about as factors that result in the creation of linguistic areas is convergence and diffusion. Convergence basically refers to convergence of different linguistic features into a single unitary system. That is, languages which belonged to different language families which had different linguistic features to represent the same phenomenon now converge into a system that is now common to all of them. This is very often seen in the Spanish and French spoken in the United States today. These languages, which have had very detailed systems of indexicality, of intimacy and respect in their second pronominal system, tu versus wu, have now given up these distinctions and converged into a format that is found in English, that is a single U, a U which is representative of respect, intimacy, or even no intimacy at all. A similar situation of convergence was observed by Gumpers and Wilson in their study in 1971 in the Kupwar region in India. In the Kupwar region, we have speakers who speak Dravidian languages like Kannada and Telugu. They also speak Indo-Aryan languages like Urdu and Marathi. Now, in these regions, a lot of linguistic features have been seen to converge such that the differences that these language families maintain regarding the formation of certain syntactic structures have been seen to have converged. Diffusion is the opposite of convergence. That is, instead of saying that linguistic features which were different in different languages belong to different languages families have converged into a single system, in diffusion what we find is that languages which have a certain linguistic feature spread this linguistic feature to languages belonging to other families that may not have had these features. And when diffusion and convergence happens, what we get are linguistic areas. So linguistic areas, as we had defined earlier, I repeat again, are geographical areas where languages that belong to different language families are spoken in a situation of contact for a sustained period of time, sometimes extending even to centuries, such that these languages which are spoken in such close proximity to each other come to resemble each other more than they resemble languages of their own family. Now, of course, when we talk about linguistic area, we cannot not talk about one of the most famous linguistic areas that is found in linguistic analysis, and that in the short form is known as SALA, and in the expanded form is known as the South Asian Linguistic Area. Yes, we are talking about the Indian subcontinent, where we have seen in our modules on language families that we've had languages that belong to 5 different language families spoken in the subcontinent and at least 4 different language families spoken in the mainland. of these languages belonging to the Indo-Aryan subgroup of Indo-European languages, the Munda subgroup of the Austro-Asiatic family, and the Dravidian languages have been in sustained contact for thousands of years. And these thousands of years of contact has resulted in many linguistic features of these languages changing, so much so that the Indo-Aryan languages of India today resemble their Dravidian and Munda neighbors much more than they resemble the European languages like English and French, to which they are actually related to. We will of course have opportunity to learn more about the South Asian linguistic area in other detailed modules on typology and linguistic areas. In this module, we would like to only briefly touch upon one example each of a phonological diffusion, of a morphological diffusion, and of a syntactic diffusion across language families in the South Asian linguistic area. A phonological phenomenon that we have already seen is that of the spread of the retroflex sounds, t, th, d, dh, n. These languages, pronounced more strongly in the Dravidian languages with a greater role of the tongues as ta, tha, da, dha, na, are pronounced to varying degrees of retroflexion in the Indo-Aryan languages, with of course going by the wave model of change, the greatest influence being seen at the areas where the Indo-Aryan languages are in actual contact with the Dravidian languages, and the influence actually getting weakened in the farther corners of the Indo-Aryan speech area. And thus we find that while Hindi, Bangla, Odia, Marathi have all developed these retroflex sounds to some varying degrees, languages like Kashmiri, spoken in one extreme, and languages like Assamese, spoken in another extreme of the Indo-Aryan speech area, have developed very little or actually no retroflexion at all. Talking about the diffusion of morphological features. Morphological features, one of the most prominent morphological features that we find diffused across language families in the South Asian context is that of the use of morphological causatives. Now, causatives can be formed in languages in three different ways. We can have lexical causatives of the type which is found in English. So, for example, we have pairs like eat and feed, where feed means to cause somebody to eat. Or we have pairs, lexical pairs like die and kill, where kill means to cause somebody to die. So, we have lexical causatives in many languages. Another way of forming causatives in languages is to make use of a syntactic strategy. English makes use of a syntactic strategy again. So, for example, when you say, I let him do it, I had him do it, it basically means that you have caused an action to come about, that the doer of the action was not the voluntary agent of doing it, and he or she was made to do it. The third strategy is what we find in most of the languages in South Asia, especially in the Indo-Aryan languages and the Dravidian languages, that of making use of a morphological strategy for representing the same meaning of causation. So, in Hindi you find pairs like marna, marna, sona, sulana, khana, khilana, where you have an addition of a morpheme a or la to form the causatives. A similar phenomenon is also observed in Dravidian languages, where you have word pairs like erudi, right, erudi pitchu, with the use of p, which basically means cause to write, which is again use of a morphological strategy. The last thing that we will see with the South Asian linguistic area is the spread of a syntactic feature. And in this context, we can talk about multi-verb expressions in many South Asian languages, where we find the use of vector verbs. We have examples of the kind in Hindi like mar dala, kha dala, likh dala, where dala, which basically means to put something somewhere, is the use of a lexical verb grammaticalized, bleached of its semantic meaning, and then used in an aspectual function. It's the same strategy that is used in many Dravidian languages like Erudi poi, Potti poi, where poi, which basically means go, is used in a grammatical sense. To conclude, we can say that linguistic acculturation is a very socially motivated process. Competing forms that exist in the languages are often finally chosen and decided on the basis of various social factors, including factors of prestige. But it is important for us to understand and study the phenomenon of linguistic acculturation, because it is very important to understand different motivations for change. Of course, we have, apart from the South Asian linguistic area, different kinds of linguistic areas like the Baltic linguistic area, the Balkan linguistic area, the Ethiopian linguistic area, and the like. But what is more interesting is that most situations of language contact and linguistic acculturation do not result in the formation of linguistic areas, and that is because the formation of linguistic areas require a kind of ad stratum influence, a kind of situation where languages meet each other on an equal footing. But what we have seen through this module and other modules is that most of the times when languages meet, they do not do so on an equal footing. Thank you.